I'd like to welcome you to this morning's panel, Perspectives on Exile. As Ángela said, my name's Rosie Rickett and I'm a member of the Northern Hispanists Network. And I'd like to thank Ángela, Ruth, James and Matt for organising everything and asking me to introduce this first session. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Manchester and my thesis is about Spanish refugees' life stories, so I'm particularly pleased to be here to listen to these papers. I'll first introduce the speakers to you all and then we'll listen to both of the papers, and after that we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. We'll hear from Maripaz Balibrea first, who lectures in modern Spanish literature and cultural studies at Birkbeck, University of London. Her research focuses on Republican exile, Francoism and post-Franco Spain, and her latest book, Tiempo de Exilio, provided a much-needed critical reflection on the ways in which historians and literary critics should or can approach Republican exile, and to what extent we can situate Republican exile within Spanish national narratives. And then we'll hear from Eva Moreda Rodriguez, who is the Lord Kelvin Adam Smith Research Fellow in Music as Cultural Practice at the University of Glasgow. Her current project focuses on the rehabilitation of exiled Republican musicians in Francoist Spain from 1950 to 1975. And she's published several articles on this subject, including most recently a piece about the composer Manuel Falla, published in the Hispanic Research Journal. So over to you, Veronica.
Thank you, Rosie. Obviously, starting by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about this project. I really appreciate it. I don't think that what I'm going to be talking about is necessarily obvious in a conference on the Spanish Civil War. So I really appreciate the broad perspective that is brought to this conference and the opportunity for interdisciplinary conversation. I think that's really valuable, and it goes to the core really of what I try to do with my topic. I'm going to be talking about collective project that I've been directing and coordinating for the last year and a half, which wants to be a history of Republican exile, but at the same time wants to be a reflection and a critique on the ways in which Spanish Republican exile, the culture of Spanish Republican exile has been historicized, and proposes ways of thinking about it differently by proposing different structures and different categories and terms and themes for thinking about it. So what I'm going to be reading is the introduction to it as a manifesto of what the book wants to be. And I want to recognize the comments and the cooperation of my colleague Sebastian Faber, who is one of the people in the collective writing about it, in making comments in the final version of this. So I'll start. It will soon be 40 years from the publication of the monumental work coordinated by José Luis Avellán, El Exilio Español de 1939, published by Taurus in 6 volumes between 1976 and 1978. The work was the first attempt to offer an all-encompassing panorama of the intellectual and cultural contribution of Republican exiles. In their ambition to include the outputs of this exile as a whole, the volumes aim to differentiate themselves from the less than reliable, often biased, and always somehow subjected to censorship, partial knowledges that authors writing under the dictatorship had managed to produce. El Exilio Español de 1939 sought to challenge and proudly respond to all the politically motivated shortcomings of its predecessors, while identifying itself distinctively as a product of democracy. The dictatorship was over, and a new democratic Spain could not afford not to include this Republican exile fully as part of its own heritage. Notwithstanding the massive contribution that its 6 volumes made to the cultural history of the Spanish Republican exile, the very nature of the project to give an account of an entire field shows the limits and challenges confronting those aspiring to produce an overview of the reality known as the culture of the Spanish Republican exile of 1939. In the epilogue to the work, Avellan deplores having had to leave things out and unsaid, but also recognizes, rightly, I think, that to persist stubbornly in an ambition to totality would have reduced the project to nothing. The legacy of exile had been generated in the imperative of a centrifugal movement in a trajectory which, having originated inside of Spain, irradiated out in a multiplicity of directions, a multiplicity that from the perspective of the first years of the transition was showing limited evidence of returning back to Spain. How to produce one narrative out of the sheer diversity? The greatest challenge that El Exilio Republicano is anxiously responding to is of a historiographical nature, namely to produce a narrative about Republican exile that is coherent, that is susceptible of being historicized and demonstrably deserving of history. Throughout the books, in the overwhelming profusion of erudite information, in the proliferation of categories subordinated to other categories of disciplinary ordering, in the long lists of people and their works, there is an anxiety that the reader can detect, the manifestation of an ethical commitment on the part of the authors. They strive to give testimony, to do justice to all by naming and locating them. The form that the books take as a result where, unquote, el acento de la obra está puesto en la información documental y bibliográfica, end of quote, as Avellan recognizes, is justified by the need to put a corpus on the record of valuable Spanish legacies because this is a necessary preliminary step to subsequent interpretive and analytical work, the kind of work that Avellan's project cannot yet accomplish. Stemming from the ethical urge, a disciplinary anxiety is also recognizable in the effort to make sure that the knowledge that is put forward fits inside recognizable and valued categories, and so each one of the 6 volumes is devoted to a discipline: political history, anthropology, education, thought, art, science, architecture, literature. The ambition behind El Exilio Español de 1939 is so great, as is the challenge it responded to, that nobody else has since been willing to emulate it. There have been, of course, works reflecting on the role played by the cultural and Republican exiles in the Spanish historiography of the 20th century, as well as specific materializations, more or less explicitly recent, of the relation of Republican exile to Spain inside histories of Spanish literature or art, published from the dictatorship and up until now. Unlike Avellan's, these other projects lacked either his overview aim or that of putting Republican exile rather than Spain at the center of its intellectual inquiry. Even though contributions have been numerous and of great importance to the study of Republican exile, they have all had a sectional character. Thanks to them, what in the volumes directed by Avellan were succinct references to titles of works, names of authors, professional careers, places of residence, ideological evolutions, notice of friendships, and even silence due to ignorance, has now, all of that, as Avellan anticipated, been amplified, corrected, made more complex and full of nuances. The result is a rich and dense network of knowledge concerning a corpus and an archive, the study of which it cannot anymore be said to be in danger of historiographical disappearance. For the last year and a half, I have been directing a book project on El Exilio Cultural Republicano de 1939 that recognizes itself as belonging to the tradition inaugurated by Avellan's project, both in its ethical and historiographical dimensions. Like El Exilio Republicano de 1939 during the transition, our aim is still to give value to the exilic corpus through an approach that puts it at the center of our intellectual endeavor and that is able to provide the reader with an overview of it. To the extent that we cannot but incorporate into our project the knowledge accumulated for the last 40 years, we're also aware that our project needs to update what those early volumes provided. In 1976, the inability to account for the totality of Republican exile could be attributed to our recognized ignorance about an important part of its realities, one determined by the conditions of access to knowledge that Francoism had imposed. Nowadays, when so much more is known about that complex legacy, the excuse of active censorship and repression of knowledge is not acceptable anymore. And yet, the task of updating is not in our project put at the service of a logic of accumulation. Our writing takes into account the knowledge about the culture of Republican exile that has been generated since the 1970s, but not with the aim to produce a synthesis of all of it. We understand today that lack of certain knowledge about the legacy of Spanish Republican exile, its relative invisibility beyond the realm of erudition and disciplinary expertise, as well as the ability to overcome those ignorance and invisibility, do not depend, not only anyway, on the disappearance of political censorship, as the authors of Avellan's volumes believed. With the passing of time, we have been able to ascertain that the public presence and visibility of Republican exile as a cultural and political legacy depended as well and continue to depend on the historiographical and conceptual structures where we in the present are able to insert them. So far, these structures, in the view of those taking part in this project, instead of promoting the value and visibility of the Republican exile legacy, have rather tended to minimize and to stand in the way of studying its specificities. It is through reflecting on these constraints and from a willingness to overcome them via the proposal of new structural and thematic categories that our project meets its aim of revising and updating the history of the cultural corpus of Spanish Republican exile. We believe that it is necessary to stimulate a kind of active historiography, one that is outspoken of the historical, ideological, and institutional premises that sustain it. To call attention to these structures is a necessary step towards the possibility of conceiving different analytical categories. In addition, and in this we move away from what the Avellan project attempted to do, ours does not organize its information with the aim of cataloging, of finding the right place for each item of information. Instead, we aim to create categories that are generative, where we believe that what we already know about Republican exile should be able to fit. But more than anything, we care that our readers will find inspiration in these categories to explore new ways of thinking about the exilic corpus, new perspectives that contribute to illuminate it from up to now undervalued or unsuspected angles. The cultural production of the Spanish Republican exile of 1939 as an object of study has been conditioned by a series of factors whose understanding and methodological incorporation into our practice is essential to achieve a different interpretative perspective, one that is more attuned to its complexity than current categories have proven able to be. And now an enumeration of those factors follows. Factor 1. Exilio Republicano de 1939 is an intrinsically political concept as far as its origins are concerned. This origin refers to the most traumatic and for this reason most defining moment of Spanish 20th century history, the Civil War. The particular relation that the Spanish state, its institutions and civil society, at every point during the dictatorship of any democracy, did establish with this event and its aftermaths, including exile, has conditioned up until today the possibility to produce knowledge about exile. The political nature of exile and everything that it produces, cultural or not, is in this sense constitutive and therefore inescapable. The political nature of Republican exile is therefore not only attributable when there is an identifiable personal or collective political activity or to an object endowed with a political theme. Whatever the approach preferred to the study of any Republican exile manifestation, the pursuit of the political will never be alien to it. Factor 2. The Republican exile of 1939 as an object of study is not only multidisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary, regardless of the inevitable limits in its field of study that every research topic sets for itself. Republican exile defines what we could call a situation, a total reality to which everything personal and social is incorporated, as is everything produced from these spheres, from the cultural, philosophical, and artistic to the technological and scientific, to produce knowledge about this exile from the watertight compartments of each one of the humanities and social sciences disciplines associated to these realities is undoubtedly an advance vis-à-vis complete ignorance. But it is a limited advance. Disciplinary procedure is confining because it divides knowledge arbitrarily according to inherited categories such as literary genres or academic fields in a way that is alien to the nature of the exilic question. By compartmentalizing and separating out exile production to fit these areas of knowledge, we stand in the way of a more complex and interconnected understanding of it. To work on any aspect of Republican exile demands an openness to transdisciplinarity, to the incorporation and combination of methodologies coming from different disciplines, to the formation of multidisciplinary research teams. Moreover, the aspiration to understand Republican exile in all its complexity requires from us scholars to be ready to question the validity of established methodologies to the extent that these constitute historical discourses and with political and ideological purchase. All in all, in its more radical moments, the Republican exile of 1939 cannot but be a post-disciplinary object. Factor 3. The Republican exile of 1939 is an historiographical anomaly. Modern history is constructed from the identifying spatio-temporal framework of the nation-state. Republican exile is the result of a violent action carried out by the Francoist state, having as a consequence the displacement of a part of the population that this state was meant to govern and protect. Thus, Republican exile should never in its conceptualization be completely disentangled from its condition as an ex-nation, i.e. a creature historically produced by the modern nation-state that is Spain. As Hannah Arendt points out in The Origins of Totalitarianism, what constitutes the modern nation-state is its ability to expel non-desirable groups and subsequently to relinquish any responsibility towards them. But at the same time, the reality of Republican exile unfolds beyond the abandoned nation in the multiplicity of vanishing points, the trajectories of thousands of exiles built in times and spaces alien to the nation of origin, in certain cases even alien to any recognizable national temporality and spatiality, Spanish or not. For this reason, the most intractable problem to deal with in relation to the categories Exilio Español de 1939 is to make sense of the aporia, the irresolvable internal contradiction in the pair Spanish exile. To the extent that Republican exile is Spanish, it has been historicized as part of this nation-state, but its substance develops necessarily outside of the time and space of the Spanish nation. Constrained to the spatio-temporal logic of the nation, the Republican exile of 1939 is doomed to be an incongruency, a margin that ends up being left out because it is not the limit of anything conceptually palpable, a clueless citizen tourist, a de facto foreigner clinging nostalgically to a Spanish identity, an experience of the now that is non-contemporaneous, a present that is only in the past, that only in the past sees a way to progress and the future, a nonsense of preoccupations and priorities, an embarrassing presence. It is urgent, therefore, to stop measuring the relevance and significance of the corpus of knowledge that constitutes the Republican exile of 1939 exclusively by its subordination to the cultural, political, and historical frameworks that explain 20th century Spain. The point here is not to negate the relations that do exist between Republican exile and Spain. It is not even a matter of de-emphasizing them. On the contrary, the presence of Republican exile in Spanish culture is undeniable, and to recognize it is inexcusable. The point here is to demonstrate that the relevance of Republican exile as an object of study is not exhausted in explications of that relationship. To demonstrate that not all matters pertaining to Republican exiles are circumscribed, for instance, to the tema de la vuelta. To demonstrate that to solve the historiographical and ethical problem posed by Republican exile is not to decide to integrate it into Spanish history or to explain it in rigorous parallel to it. Spanish Republican exile generated many realities that still wait for us to propose an order to them through interpretive narratives. Multinationality, anationality, supranationality, multitemporality. We need to invent neologisms that help us conceive the experience of Republican exile besides and beyond Spain, in the same way that their protagonists had to reinvent themselves in relation to these experiences, as well as the structures of analysis and periodization to sustain them. By the same token, we need to associate ourselves to already existing parameters of analysis in order to explain exile. Transnational categories such as modernity and its crisis, avant-garde, Cold War, Europe, Hispanism, revolution, internationalism, anti-fascism, anti-communism, intellectual commitment, need to be explored to the extent that they can make sense and inject congruency to realities which, seen exclusively from the logic of the already defined priorities of 20th century Spanish historiography, lack any meaning and therefore any relevance. There is still a lot that we do not know in this respect and of importance, since from these connections we can achieve a much wider knowledge that we now have of the contributions that Republican exile made to 20th century world history. To insist on these kinds of connections amount to a strategic call to demarginalize this exile by widening the geopolitical limits of its influence in a moment of intense globalization of political conflicts, a globalization that exiles were forced to embrace and respond to, much more than those who willy-nilly remained in Francoist Spain. The legacy of Republican exile is further dignified when we make room for them next to other much better known individual or collective protagonists of these times in Europe and Latin America, many of whom, by the way, were also part of displaced communities. When approached from these perspectives, Republican exile stops being necessarily subordinated to Spanish events. Accepting them as valid angles for the study of Republican exile requires that we agree with the idea that El Exilio Español de 1939 is not an Spanish phenomenon only, but also that we agree with the need to question the limits of what is to be considered relevant in the interpretations of things as Spanish during the 20th century. By putting emphasis on what is global or supranational instead of what is national, we destabilize the notions handed down to us of what is marginal and what is central, what is inside and what is excluded from historical narratives, and we displace from their default position as focus of interest everything and anything that happens to have taken place inside of Spain. As a result, we create borders that are porous and permeable, more contradictory, more subject to change and ambiguity. It is in all those senses that our project aims to be a historiographical intervention. Factor 4. There is no possible closure to the histories of the Republican exile of 1939. Where does Republican exile end? National narratives inside of Spain, in particular those hegemonic ones during the Transición, portrayed the return to Spain of a handful of Republican exile intellectuals and politicians and the removal of the political and legal impediment to return to their country as proof that the whole phenomenon had come to a happy ending, one that conveniently coincided with the death of the individuals at stake. Despite the high hopes that someone like Avellán had for the return of Republican exiles, what national hegemonic discourses were in a hurry to do was to normalize the anomaly of exile. The preponderance of biology as determining fatally when the end of Republican exile occurs helped this normalization greatly, i.e., once the Republican exile person is dead, exile ceases to be an issue to be reckoned with by the nation. Rather than attending to the complexity of exile and to its incorporation into the new democratic state, as Avellán and his collaborators dreamed, the public uses of Republican exile contributed to minimize the wealth of this exile's ethical and historical specificity until it dissolved into pure irrelevance. The result of these integrative narratives, to put it crudely, was the extermination of Republican exile as a useful legacy for the country. By contrast, our project lets go of any attempt to claim that the full integration of Republican exile into the Spanish nation is in any way the objective of our historiography. We believe that the study of Republican exile is, as far as Spain is concerned, and to some extent to be kept as an extra-national, impossible to absorb legacy. As such, we can keep its relevance open into the future as a critical memory of the victims and witnesses of horrors. In some cases, even as proponents of alternatives to this horror, from which to think about and intervene in the present. In addition, the individuals and communities making up Republican exile contributed greatly through their knowledges and skills to the histories of the places where they settled. Their work in many cases has left a profound imprint and lives on, not only in memory, but also in the creations and innovations that materialize through institutions, buildings, archives, schools, genealogies, knowledges, and nowadays part of the everyday life of many across the planet. To mark and to acknowledge this long-lasting trail is to pay homage to the exiles who made it possible, but it is also living proof of the multiplicity of positive continuities open into the future that have at their origin this traumatic aftermath of the Spanish Civil War. And I now have a couple of pages is speaking more specifically about the project, but I don't want to go for too long. So if maybe I should stop here, and people who are really interested can ask me later on.
All right, because it's past, so then we'll have
Thanks,
definitely have time for questions.
Thank you.